This video will discuss murder and the abuse of drugs, though not in detail. Please keep that in mind when deciding whether to watch it. Also, I will be pronouncing several names and words from Arabic and Persian, neither of which I know very well, so I apologize in advance for any and all mispronunciations. Please check the captions for the spelling if necessary. And now, let us begin. It probably goes without saying that when the Crusaders left the Levant, they took a vast amount of knowledge with them. And out of all that knowledge, I think it's safe to say that the stories of the Hashashin captured people's imagination in a way astronomy treatises didn't. A group of single-minded killers who could and would strike at any time, all to further the mysterious goals of the old man of the mountain, who used strange drugs to convince his followers that he alone could guarantee them a place in paradise. The threat of death mattered not to these men, and why should it? They were sure of their final destination, after all. Eventually, the name Hashashin became the word assassin, and assassin came to mean any murderer, as the original assassins, what did happen to them? Let's see. In my research, I found one book that's considered the book about the assassins. Oh, I'm going to be using the word assassins in this video to refer to the group from medieval times, not in the generic sense of killers. Anyway, my source is from the 1950s, so for it to still be the standard book about its subject even now, that tells you something about the quality of the work. Unfortunately, it's from the 1950s, so it's also very hard to read. I do encourage you all to look at my sources for yourself so you don't just take my word for things, but in this case I have to warn you all what you're getting into. This book is just not a good read. Again, please read it yourself if you want to, just know what you'll be signing up for. So with that note about the sources, let's get into the history. The assassins were formed around 1090 CE by a Persian Ismâʻîlî Muslim named Hassan II. I imagine a lot of people watching this aren't very familiar with the different groups within Islam, so let me explain what it means to be an Ismâʻîlî Muslim. There are two main groups within Islam, Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. The main difference between them that I'd say is most relevant to understanding who the assassins were is that Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims disagree on who has authority over the general community, now that there's no prophet to make decisions and resolve questions. The Sunni position is that the community now needs to look out for itself, and God will make sure that things don't go wrong. The Shia position is that Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, had authority over the community after the Prophet's death, which was then inherited by his son's through Fatima, the Prophet's daughter. Different Shia groups disagree over who inherited authority when various, let's say, succession crises occurred. The two largest Shia groups nowadays, also the major Shia groups at the time of the assassins, are the Twelvers and the Ismâʻîlîs. These groups agree on who the first 6 imams were, an imam being the person who has authority over the community in the time after the Prophet's death. The 6th imam had 2 sons that different groups of people considered his successor. One branch became the Twelvers, who recognized 12 imams. The 12th disappeared as a child, so there couldn't be a successor to him, but he'll return at some point to usher in the end times, according to the Twelvers. The Ismâʻîlîs, at least the largest group of them, recognize a line of imams that continues even to our own time. The current imam for them is the 4th Aga Khan, who spends much of his time organizing humanitarian work, according to the internet. But that's the Ismâʻîlîs now. What were they doing back when Hassan II decided to make his own group of killers? In the 11th century, the Ismâʻîlî imams ruled over Egypt. This was the time of what's now called the Fatimid Caliphate, after the ruler's ancestor Fatima. It was a good time to live in Egypt. The country was peaceful, prosperous, and powerful. And then the 8th Caliph, Al-Mustansir, turned out to be not entirely up to the task of ruling. He was essentially a puppet who could only watch as others ruled. This led to widespread violence and a general decline of Fatimid power, as you might expect. Meanwhile, a young man from Persia was learning about Ismâʻîlism and deciding that it was exactly the truth he'd been searching for. Hassan II eventually impressed his teachers enough that they decided he should travel to Cairo to learn from the best, and presumably get promoted to being a teacher of Ismâʻîlism himself. And so, in 1078 CE, he did make his way to Cairo after a bunch of side trips. Once he was there, Hassan got involved with court politics and came to the attention of the caliph's vizier, and not for good reasons. You see, Al-Mustansir had more than one son who was up for consideration as his successor. The vizier wanted the man who would eventually become the caliph Al-Musta'li to take the throne. Hassan was known to support Nizârî, the caliph's oldest son, instead. Ismaili imams usually made and make an official declaration of who their successor will be, and Al-Mustansir had already declared Nizârî would take his place, so Hassan was just following his imam's lead. However, the vizier was the real power in Egypt then, so Hassan had to leave the country after a few years. He still believed in the cause of making the whole Muslim world Ismaili though, so he ended up dedicating his life to that cause. Since the main power in the Muslim world at the time was the Seljuk state, which was mainly Sunni, he decided to assemble a force that could break their power and clear the field for Ismailism, and to do that, he needed a base. The most famous place associated with the assassins is probably the mountain fortress of Alamut, the Eagle's Nest, and there's a good reason for that. Alamut was the first fortress they occupied and one of the last ones they left. So how did Hassan II take it? He won the local people over to his cause, and eventually the fort was full of troops loyal to him. By 1090, Alamut was Hassan's, and soon so was another of the assassins' major forts in Persia, Gerdkuh, the Round Mountain. To give you an idea of where this all was happening, both of those forts were in what's now central Iran, just south of the Caspian Sea, in roughly this dark brown line in this map of Iran at the top. As you might imagine, these were fairly empty, isolated places high up in the mountains. Great for bases for an organization that's trying to take on the world and win. And the assassins were fighting against the whole Muslim world soon enough. In 1094, Al-Mustansir died, and his sons started fighting over who would become the new caliph. After about a year, Nizârî was executed, and Al-Musta'li was firmly in control of Egypt. But Nizârî's supporters weren't willing to give up. The Ismailis of Persia and Syria broke away from the Fatimids and banded together in common cause as the Nizârîs, under the leadership of Hassan II in Alamut. So what exactly were they fighting for? Hassan II was the main ideologue for the Nizârîs when he was alive, and a man who founded a group that struck so much terror into the hearts of the Muslim world had a way of thinking that struck terror into the hearts of Muslim thinkers, at least the Sunni ones. A certain kind of rationalism was popular with Muslim thinkers at the time, using logic to work out the relationships between various objects and categories and so on. It's pretty similar to the scholasticism of medieval Europe, at least to my eye. What Hassan did with it was make an argument that human reason could only figure out that it wasn't up to the task of figuring out anything, at least nothing that really mattered, which meant the divine. He also argued that whenever a group had different opinions in it, that was a sign of error and falsehood. A unified group would have the truth. In short, he was arguing that being united under an imam was necessary for Muslims to have access to the truth, and truth was whatever the imam said. At least, I think that's what he was arguing. These sorts of arguments are never easy for me to follow, and the book presenting them, again, isn't the easiest to read. I admit I may be getting things wrong on this point. This line of thinking was extremely disturbing for Sunni thinkers of the time, since it was pretty directly opposed to how they thought about proper authority. The Sunni thinker of the era, Al-Ghazali, spent much of his time figuring out counter-arguments and in the process laid the groundwork for a lot of later Sunni thought. At any rate, the emphasis on unity explains the devotion the Nizârîs would have had to Hassan and his program. Living in a community that puts so much stress on being of one mind would make it really hard to say no when the leader asked you to do something, I imagine. Speaking of leadership, I should clarify that Hassan II never claimed to be the Imam of the Nizârîs. He acted as something like a regent for the Imam, who was in hiding and never actually identified in Hassan's time. Hodgson, the author of a book I used for research, speculates that Hassan didn't really care who the Imam was after Nizâr's death, since Hassan's way of thinking about the Imam was so abstract that it didn't much matter what the actual man on the throne was like. Anyway, once Alamut and Gurkuh were in the assassins' hands, they quickly began working to topple the Seljuks however they could. After a few attempts at conventional battle that didn't go very well, the plan became hole up in the mountains and strike at people who are obstacles to the cause when the chance arises. The plan did work, somewhat. The assassins stayed alive and did scare some people into submitting to them, but they also couldn't do much more than maintain what they already had. Pretty much the last time they gained anything was when the Syrian Nizârîs moved out of the cities of Aleppo and Damascus and into various mountain fortresses in the 1130s and 1140s. And for reference, those castles were all in the Syrian coastal range, roughly in the white blob on the map between the purple and orange blobs. As you can see, they were concentrated into a fairly small space without much room to grow. So we know why the assassins did what they did, but what was it they actually did? There's no shortage of stories about their activities, but most of them are, well, stories. There's no evidence for most of the things that have been said about the assassins. In particular, they almost certainly never used hashish or any other drug for their purposes. Hassan II was famously opposed to intoxication of any kind, to the point that he executed his own son for drunkenness, which is a crime in Islam, though I don't think the usual penalty is death. It doesn't make much sense for a man like that to start an organization that made a habit of using drugs for anything. There's far too many stories about the assassins that sound like they were made up to list, but in general, most of them have something to do with how obedient the rank and file were and how good they were at staying undetected before they made their move. The obedience, I think, is pretty much just the result of living in a community where absolute unity of the group is one of the major ideals, and there isn't much evidence of the assassins having special training in how to stay undetected. The Syrian assassins consistently used random volunteers for their killings, and all of the assassins had a habit of killing their targets in public places. I don't think stealth was much of a concern for them. I should also point out that the assassins didn't only target kings or viziers or other such important people. They also killed local authority figures who opposed Ismâʻîlism, preachers and judges and the like. In my opinion, that broad range of targets helps to explain why the assassins were so feared. They killed anyone they considered an obstacle to their cause, no matter how important or nameless, and they did it in broad daylight where everyone could see it, just to make sure people got the message. That must have been terrifying. No wonder the old man of the mountain was practically a demon in their eyes. Speaking of the old man of the mountain, he wasn't Hassan II. He wasn't even a contemporary of him. Rashid ad-Din Sinan was born in the 1130s, about 10 years after the death of Hassan II. He spent his youth at Alamut alongside the boy who would become Hassan II of Alamut, and they were apparently close friends. When Hassan II took over Alamut and the Nizârîs as a whole in 1162, he sent Sinan to Syria to lead the Nizârîs there. Both men worked together to proclaim a new era for the Nizârîs, one where the truth and, by extension, God would now be directly accessible to ordinary people, at least the ones who were proper Nizârîs. This also meant getting rid of certain important rituals, since in Ismâʻîlî thought, the purpose of those rituals is to prepare people for the truth. Rituals like fasting during Ramadan. As part of this, Hassan II was recognized as the Imam. It was eventually determined that he was a secret descendant of Nizâr who had been raised by Muhammad ibn Buzurgumid, their leader before Hassan II. Determined by the Nizârîs, I should say. I think most historians would say that Hassan II was indeed the son of Muhammad ibn Buzurgumid. Anyway, Sinan had charge of the Syrian Nizârîs for about 30 years, dying sometime in the early 1190s. There isn't a clear date for his death. In that time, his charisma won him the respect of the community to the point that dozens of legends about him sprang up. He seems to have had a reputation for clairvoyance, that is, knowing the details of events he wasn't there for, as well as knowing what people were thinking. He was even counted as an imam by some of the Nizârîs. Sinan was also famous among the Crusaders, since he was active in Syria at the time of the Third Crusade, which meant they dealt with him a fair bit. In fact, for a long time, it was mostly the Syrian Nizârîs who had any significant contact with the wider world. Hassan II's new age meant that everyone who wasn't a Nizârî wasn't important and might as well not exist. The Persian Nizârîs were a fair bit more isolated from the Crusades than their Syrian compatriots, so they spent a long time not doing much that shows up in the historical record. Mostly, they developed their new doctrines and occasionally raided local caravans. By the time that Muhammad III of Alamut took charge of the Nizârîs in 1210, things had gotten to the point where he converted to Sunni Islam because he wanted glory, and joining in the wider Muslim world was the only way he saw to get it. Most of the people under him seem to have seen his conversion as an act in line with the long-standing Shia practice of avoiding persecution by pretending to not be Shia. They went back to Ismâʻîlism after he died pretty quickly. Still, the Nizârîs clearly didn't have much power by that point. Abandoning their cause, even temporarily, couldn't have been anything but an acknowledgement that they couldn't beat their enemies, so they might as well join them. After Muhammad III, the only thing left for the Nizârîs was to undo their conversion and try and fight the Mongols. When the Mongols invaded Persia in the 1250s, they made destroying the assassins a priority. By 1260, just about all of the Persian Nizârî fortresses were in Mongol hands, and it wasn't long after that the Syrian Nizârîs were under the thumb of Baybars, the new Sultan of Egypt. Baybars made the Syrian Nizârîs a subject people who were paid to assassinate enemies of the regime. Eventually, the Ottomans conquered Egypt and Syria, which meant that they got to control the Nizârîs. They were incorporated into the Ottomans' millet system of organizing their subjects and became one of the many groups ruled by the Sublime Porte. The Persian Nizârîs scattered to the four winds and eventually gathered in what's now Pakistan and India. Nowadays, Nizârî Muslims live all over the world and recognize the fourth Aga Khan as their current imam, and much of the community is involved in humanitarian work. A group founded to win the whole world by killing anyone who was an obstacle, now acting as philanthropists all across the globe. History really does like to keep us guessing.